other charges. Hunter Biden's legal team believes that this was, in effect, a global agreement, sort of a one and done. He would do this plea. There would be a diversion program for this gun offense, but then that would be it. There would be no further prosecution. But the government's position is different. The government's position as to hypothetical, if there could be charges in the future from the ongoing investigation, for example, violation of foreign lobbying laws, the representative of the U.S. attorney said, yes, that is possible. And that is when the entire deal fell down. I would note that when the judge came in today, frankly, she came in hot to this courtroom. She said that this diversion agreement on the gun charge included a lot of language that was not standard, terms that were not ordinary. So she came in with a lot of very pointed questions about whether this agreement was something that she was going to be asked to rubber stamp or whether she could really analyze and feel comfortable with. Errol and Lana.
Catherine, both parties came into court today believing that they had a deal in place. Is there any possibility, after you explained that both with the judge's questions and the representation by both sides that they had different positions on this, that a deal may still be struck today? Or is that off entirely?
Well, listen, a lot's happening in that courtroom while I'm down here talking to you. They've taken this recess, kind of a last-ditch effort to see whether they can have a meeting of the minds and whether they can salvage this plea agreement. Because remember, once that plea agreement is off the table, the trial clock is ticking. They're already talking about some pretrial motions and status hearings at the beginning of September. So there's an effort to see if they can salvage it. Both parties wanted to come in here today, get the plea agreement on the 2 misdemeanor tax charges, then also this diversion program for the gun felony charge. That was the possession of a firearm by a drug user. But at this point, it does not appear that it will proceed. This is a major blow to both the defendant's legal team as well as the U.S. government. And it comes back to an idea that really caught my attention in June when this plea agreement was first announced. Hunter Biden's attorney, Chris Clark, said as far as they were concerned, this was the end of the road for his legal problems. But the U.S. Attorney's Office at that time said and confirmed that there was an ongoing investigation. And it's this gap, this daylight, which has really, I think, put the whole deal in question today.
And Catherine, you've done a great job in kind of resetting for our viewers what the plea agreement was. You mentioned he had pleaded guilty to possession of a handgun by a drug user. That's a felony. He had pleaded guilty to failure to pay taxes. That's a misdemeanor. Remind us of what the plea deal was and what Hunter Biden's reaction was in the room when this unfolded.
Right. Well, I just want to clarify something. Think about this deal as having two elements or being bifurcated. On the tax charges, these were 2 misdemeanors for the failure to pay taxes in 2017 and 2018. And what we learned in court today is that there were multiple reminders to Hunter Biden. He had the money to pay, but he failed to pay the IRS in excess of $100,000 for both of those tax years. On the separate track was this felony gun charge. Technically, he was not pleading guilty to that. He was going to enter what's called a diversion program, which frankly is a little unusual. Under the diversion program that was in the agreement, he would get the charge dismissed in the future if he abided by the terms. And a source close to the agreement had told CBS News that included no further, criminal activity and no drug use. So those were the 2 buckets or the 2 elements, if you will.
And his reaction in the courtroom?
Yeah. He came into the courtroom. I was maybe 20 feet behind him. He was a lot of energy, standing upright, very sort of outgoing, if you will. He shook hands with some of the people on the U.S. Attorney's team. He sort of nodded at the U.S. Attorney David Weiss, who's been leading this probe. But really, out of the gate, there was a lot of tension in that courtroom. It was clear to me from my vantage point that the judge had a lot of very serious questions about the structuring of this agreement, specifically the diversion program for the felony gun possession, And in the course of the hearing, we heard Hunter Biden say at one point that he only agreed to this plea deal because of the promises that he had been made for what could happen in the future, only to later reverse that. And as the hearing progressed, he seemed, in my view, sort of increasingly unsettled as to what was unfolding. Understandably, right? He came in here today expecting that the plea agreement would be behind him and he could move on with his life. And right now we're at a point where the last we heard officially in the court is there was no deal, and from the defense point of view, that it was null and void. That could change. They could have a meeting of the minds in this recess, but that's the state of play.
All right, Catherine, thank you very much. We'll continue checking in with you throughout the day.
Welcome.
We're going to bring in now Thomas Dupree Jr. He's a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Thomas, given that this plea agreement has fallen through, tell us what happens now.
Well, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to see if they can try to salvage this. As Catherine reported, it sounds like the defense lawyers and the prosecutors are going to meet in a closed room and see if there's any possible way they can salvage this deal and get it back on track. If those efforts fail, though, then we go back to where we were before the plea agreement was struck. Namely, you'll have pending criminal charges against Hunter Biden. He'll have to figure out how to defend those. The prosecution will move ahead. And at the same time, the prosecution will continue investigating whatever other possible charges they've been looking into. So if this plea agreement falls through, we're kind of back to square one, and the prosecution will be on the calendar and we'll move ahead.
And Thomas, the way Catherine spelled this out is quite fascinating in that Hunter Biden enters the courtroom today, as we see this footage from earlier, expecting for this plea deal to kind of be rubber stamped, and he gets on with his life. We understand there was a press conference scheduled for after this hearing. Just for the uninitiated, for the layman, how does something like this happen? A plea agreement reached by both sides falling apart in a courtroom because of a judge's questions.
It's very unusual, I will say that. Look, judges do have authority to reject plea agreements. But again, it's very unusual. Normally, when the prosecutors and the defense come into court and they say, we've reached an agreement to resolve this case, it makes everyone happy, please approve it, judges will sign off on that. Obviously, this one didn't, but to her credit, this judge was performing her duty. Before approving a plea agreement, she has to make sure, she has to satisfy herself that it is in the interests of justice to approve it. She obviously had a lot of questions today. She was concerned about the propriety of reaching a plea agreement when there are still outstanding, possible pending charges and ongoing investigation against Hunter Biden. And so she kicked the tires on this deal and at the end of the day said, look, I just can't approve this.
Might we see additional information or evidence submitted in this case now?
There sure could be. I mean, look, this kind of re-scrambles everything. In other words, right now, we began this morning thinking that at least this chapter in Hunter Biden's life and this long-running legal saga, remember, this has been a 4 or 5 year investigation, was finally going to come to an end. It's going to be all wrapped up in this plea agreement. That has been apparently, for now, exploded. So we go back to the way things were before, namely a prosecution that's moving ahead. To your point, there'll be other evidence developed. There'll be other things looking into because the prosecutors now have a live case on their hands. And there may come a time when they're going to have to prove this case in front of a jury. So they'll need to start pulling together their evidence, their witnesses, and get ready to make this case as it moves ahead.
Catherine Herridge also mentioned that the U.S. attorney in Delaware has their own probe underway. The judge was worried that, look, there may be some overlap here and that this plea agreement effectively closes the door to any further punishment for crimes, seeming crimes that are found. Can you help us understand that component of this development?
Sure. It sounds like what was bothering the judge is that normally when you have a plea agreement, the idea is that it wraps up all the pending legal proceedings, all the pending criminal charges against the defendant. In other words, the defendant agrees to plead to certain charges. They agree to whatever the recommended sentence is going to be, and the whole thing is tied up within a box with a bow on it. And the judge's concern is, she said, wait a minute. That's apparently not what's happening here. Even if we reach this agreement today, it sounds like the Justice Department, the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, the D.C. Justice Department, they're still looking into possible criminal activity by Hunter Biden. And so no matter what we agree today, that's not going to wrap everything up. It's not going to bring everything to a close. And as Catherine reported, this seems to have been just some sort of massive communication breakdown between Hunter Biden's team and the U.S. Attorney, and that Hunter Biden's team apparently believed, or at least they were saying, this puts everything to rest. And the U.S. Attorney was saying, actually, it doesn't put anything to rest. And that's what was bothering the judge. And it sounds like that's why she refused to sign off on this deal.
Yeah, but so to that point then, Thomas, why would the U.S. attorneys have offered a plea deal if they knew that there was still all this other stuff that potentially was outstanding? Was it was that potentially trying to obfuscate the fact that they wanted to get this win and that they still had these other things that were outstanding there?
It's a great question. I mean, look, one possibility is that when they claim that they were still investigating things, they actually weren't. So that's one possibility, is that this really did wrap up everything the government was looking at. The other possibility is that the government just thought that they could really kind of segregate everything and say, look, we're investigating him on a bunch of charges. We've reached conclusions as to these tax charges and as to this gun charge. Let's put those to bed, reach an agreement as to those. And then on the other side of the ledger, we'll continue investigating him for other crimes. The government apparently thought it could draw that dividing line, put these crimes in one box and these crimes in another box and move on. But the judge said, I'm not buying that.
Thomas Dupree Jr., keep your phone handy, stay close by for us. We also want to show, and thank you very much, I just want to also show our viewers this empty podium. The story is what you're not seeing. Hunter Biden was scheduled to address the media after this plea agreement being stamped and sealed. It's unclear now if that will happen with the news that this plea deal fell apart in the courtroom. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane is also following this for us from Capitol Hill. Scott, what are you hearing from your sources on the Hill about what's unfolding right now?
Already some reaction from U.S. House Republicans who have led their own investigation of Hunter Biden since taking the majority in January. Florida Republican Byron Donalds posting a few moments ago, enough with the sweetheart deals, it's time to apply the law equally. Republicans have been emphatic and unequivocal over the recent months, saying that this plea agreement that was on the table at some point before today's proceedings began was a sweetheart deal, that it not only had that deferred prosecution agreement, which is exceptionally rare in federal criminal cases, but averted prison time for Hunter Biden in a tax case and a case that also had a firearms charge component. So they're likely going to be celebrating the evaporation of that plea deal today. And I can tell you this, Errol and Lana, having watched, I believe, thousands of federal plea agreements over the years in federal courts, they do sometimes just fall apart in the room on that day. But it's most often because the defendant equivocates when pressed by the judge if he or she accepts responsibility for A, B, and C for this list of facts. There are times when defendants try to have it both ways, try to get the plea deal, get the courtesy of the plea deal, but also try to retain their claims of innocence. That doesn't go over well with judges. Sometimes the plea agreement is taken down by the judge, not by the parties. This is obviously a singular case, but I think it underscores something else, something that has been the source of criticism from Republicans. This is a unique thing. It has been a unicorn case from the start. A deferred prosecution agreement is something you tend to get at the local courthouse down the road for a DUI or for a misdemeanor in your community. At the federal level, they just don't do these things often. And you saw it today fall apart at the courthouse steps.
Well, I'm wondering, Scott, and part of this is just tapping into your experience, having covered the Hill, having covered these court cases in your career. How much did the pressure from Republicans lead to this outcome today?
There was more than just political pressure. Again, this case has been a unicorn. It's been different from the start. At the 11th hour yesterday, there was an amicus brief, a legal filing from the House Ways and Means Committee, which caused a whole kerfuffle in the federal court about some records being on the public docket that shouldn't have been. The House committees that investigated Hunter Biden, they found a way, at least briefly yesterday, to get some of their findings on the public docket in this case. It caused some consternation at the courthouse, some allegations that Hunter Biden's legal team, or the law firm representing him, overstepped to try to get that information taken back down. So that became part of the ecosystem, this unique ecosystem in this case. The House investigation has applied some level of political pressure in the conservative media and, to a degree, the mainstream media. But in this case, in this distinctive case, they actually made a filing. They got the attention of the judge and the court and had an untold influence on what happened here today.
And Scott, are we hearing anything from yet? I mean, this has only just unfolded in the past 60 minutes, but anything from Democrats or other reaction there on Capitol Hill?
We're waiting for the Democratic reaction, and there have been congressional staffers who reached out to me questioning the significance, the magnitude of what happened in court today. There's been some accusations that there's false equivalencies being made here by Republicans between Hunter Biden's legal troubles and former President Trump's multiple legal troubles. I'll also note one of the first people to disseminate the breaking news today on social media was the Republican chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer of Kentucky, who has led his committee's own investigation of Hunter Biden. I suspect what happened today in court is going to be amplified quite a bit by House Republicans who've been critical of this plea deal since the moment it was announced last month.
All right, Scott MacFarlane live for us there on Capitol Hill. Stay close, Scott. We'll be connecting with you, no doubt, in the hours ahead. And a quick summary for our viewers. The plea deal in the case of President Biden's son, Hunter. You see him here walking into the courtroom this morning. That plea deal is now in jeopardy.
The judge in the case has issue with portions of the deal and is looking for additional clarification before accepting the terms. As we understand, Hunter Biden had agreed to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts of failure to pay income taxes. As part of his plea deal, Hunter Biden would have avoided prosecution on a separate felony gun possession charge.
CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge, I understand, still plugged in, joins us now. Catherine, what's the latest?
Well, when I left the courtroom about 15 minutes ago, the U.S. government, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware, and Hunter Biden's legal team were going to have a conversation about whether they could salvage this plea agreement. But when I left, the deal was clearly in jeopardy. A member of the U.S. Attorney's team told the court that there was no deal. And one of the lead attorneys for Hunter Biden, Chris Clark, said as far as he was concerned, quote, the plea deal was null and void. It was an extremely complex legal discussion over the last couple of hours, but I would boil it down to this. It does appear that the two parties have been talking past each other for months. In this respect, the U.S. Attorney's Office says there's an ongoing investigation and there could be criminal charges in the future. The understanding of Hunter Biden's legal team is that this amounted to a global agreement, and that once a decision was made with the tax misdemeanor and then this felony gun charge, that it was kind of a one and done situation. There would be no further prosecution. And just let me talk you through what I think was the critical moment when the deal seemed to completely fall apart.
Yeah.
The judge in this case, Mary Ellen Noreika, she's a Trump appointee, but a reputation as someone really just, right down the middle. She was probing the sides for about 2 hours to try and understand the details of the plea and what her role was exactly in her own terms. Am I just supposed to rubber stamp this? And she said to the rep from the U.S. Attorney's Office, talk to me more about this ongoing investigation. What kind of charges could you be looking at in the future? And he said, I can't really talk about hypothetical charges, but I can talk about what we wouldn't see under this deal, which would be tax crimes, for example, or further crimes related to that gun possession. And then the question was posed, but what about a violation of the Foreign Agents Lobbying Act? Hunter Biden, as you know, was doing business with Chinese entities, the Ukraine energy company, Romania, and others. And the U.S. attorney said that hypothetically that could be possible. And that was the point at which Hunter's attorney, Chris Clark, said, we don't have an agreement here. that is not our understanding. Understanding is that our client pleads and basically we're done. So it could be salvaged in the next few minutes, but it's just been unexpected, complicated, and I would say the president's son, as we've watched the hearing progress, and in my view, has seemed the deal is further and further out of reach, has seemed to become sort of more anxious or agitated, which would be expected.
Catherine, you have been covering these allegations that members of the FBI and Department of Justice have been allowing their own politics to interfere with the equal application of justice and the law. Remind our viewers about what you have been investigating and how Hunter Biden's case falls into all of that.
So Hunter Biden's case began back in 2018. It began, what we know now from one of the IRS case agents, is that he was investigating a social media company into potential sex trafficking allegations. And they came across Hunter Biden's business information. That was the catalyst for the whole thing starting. For 5 years, they've looked at a whole universe of possible charges. Not only tax charges, felony tax charges, also potential violations of this foreign lobbying laws, also money laundering. But at the end of the day, the plea agreement was to 2 misdemeanor tax charges, failure to pay in 2017 and 2018. We learned something very important in court today, and just stay with me on the tax case while I explain it. Hunter Biden's drug addiction problems are well documented. 2017, 2018, he did not pay tax in those years, even though he had the money, the court was told, to pay. He later filed in 2019 at a time where he told the court that he was clean and he was sober. But what's contained in the records today is that even when he was clean and sober, he filed tax statements where he took personal deductions as business expenses. So one of the arguments there is that his addiction problems doesn't explain those filed tax returns in 2019. What we heard from IRS whistleblowers who spoke exclusively with CBS News is that they believed the evidence supported more serious felony tax charges. And it wasn't just their say-so. Exhibits were entered into the congressional record that showed in 2021 and 2022 there was a recommendation for prosecution on multiple tax felonies, and that this recommendation was agreed to by the Assistant U.S. Attorney in Delaware, as well as members of the Justice Department Tax Division. Final thought before I'll sort of park it with you. Just because something is recommended does not mean it will be prosecuted. A prosecutor has to decide whether they can make the case to the jury. And the IRS whistleblower told us that the U.S. Attorney had shared with him that there was concern at the Tax Division, at the Justice Department, that because of his well-documented problems with addiction, some of those tax years could get thrown out, and in fact everything could get thrown out with a jury because they would be very sympathetic. It brings us to today, which in some respects is very unexpected, but also could have real political implications for Hunter Biden's father. It's clear to me in the recent months they've wanted to get this deal done no matter what. They've wanted to close the chapter on this whole episode in terms of the Justice Department, and then the Republicans, especially in the House, they could continue their own investigations. But it's not at all clear now that this chapter in the criminal justice system will end today.
And of course, we're speaking about the sitting president's son. Mm-hmm. So people are watching this and wondering, hey, if any of us were to have committed or alleged to have committed these crimes, would we all get the same treatment as far as paying taxes? And as you noted, Catherine, he pleaded to a diversion program for the possession of a gun, which would have been a felony. And you note that that is unusual in the court system. We'll let you go for now so you can... Yep, go ahead.
Right. Just one final point, if I could. One of the things that the judge was very clear today was what the maximum sentences can be with these charges. The failure to pay the maximum can be 1 year in prison and the very hefty fines. On the felony gun possession, so this is the possession of a firearm by a drug user, that can be up to 10 years. I mean, this is a very serious business. I'm not saying that that would be sentenced in this case. He agreed to enter a diversion program if the plea agreement goes ahead. But that, I just want to give some context to people at home, that those are the kind of maximums you're looking at. And the thing with the tax charges is they have a concept of the equitable treatment of taxpayers. And what that means is that when people lie to the IRS, they don't want to have a system where rich people with money and lawyers are able to kind of skate on these charges. They want to have a system where, regardless of who you are and how much money you earn, that if you lie to the IRS or you fail to pay, everyone will be held to the same standard. Everyone should really have the same level of punishment. And that's one of the central questions that's been at the heart of this case. Hunter Biden's attorneys believe that he's been given sort of extra scrutiny because of his position, that he's the son of a president, and that this investigation has been thorough. Critics say that if it was Hunter Smith and not Hunter Biden, you would be looking at a very different set of consequences and outcomes in terms of the punishment.
Very eye-opening, and likely why, as you say, Hunter was so unsettled in the courtroom, watching this all fall apart, facing a potential of 10 years in prison just for the gun charge. Catherine Herridge, thank you. We'll stay very close. CBS News
You're welcome.
Congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, also following the twists and turns here, joins us now. Scott, what can you tell us that you're hearing from Capitol Hill?
Just the latest Rorschach test of where American politics are at this uniquely toxic moment. Democrats saying this is an indication there is no two-tier justice system. If this were a sweetheart deal and it just fell apart, it's a sign the system works. Republicans saying this shows it was a two-tier justice system because, in their words, a sweetheart deal was cut. Just speaks to the moment, doesn't it, where you have those diametrically opposed reactions to the same thing. We've watched so many, more than 500 plea agreement hearings in the January 6th prosecutions here in Washington. We have watched this type of moment play out where the judge calls the parties to the bench and says, do you have an agreement? Is everybody on the same page? And we've seen several occasions, Errol and Lana, where the deal just falls apart right there in the courtroom, but for a different reason. It's often that the defendant has this moment that I characterize as have your cake and eat it too, where he or she is acknowledging the charges in the plea agreement, accepting the terms of the deal, but still tries to insist on his or her innocence when queried by the judge. When that happens, the judge calls the whole thing off and says, you're not really pleading guilty if you're still defying the facts that you're acknowledging in this case. This, of course, was quite different. This was a deferred prosecution agreement folded into a plea agreement. That is not something common in the federal system. It wasn't surprising when the federal judge, a Trump appointee, walked into the courtroom in Wilmington today and started querying both parties about what this deal says. And there was a level of discomfort articulated in court today with a deferred prosecution agreement being folded into a prosecution, a plea agreement in which the prosecutor says the investigation's not yet complete. That house of cards collapsed earlier today. It's unclear how fast you can rebuild that type of house of cards. These plea agreements often take weeks, if not months, to come to a conclusion on. To rebuild it on the fly in the federal court in Wilmington, that might be a very heavy lift.
Well, Scott, obviously we should caution our viewers that this is all still breaking news.
Yep.
We do not know if this deal will still be salvaged. We know that both sides are still trying to work towards that. In fact, that's part of what the judge has commanded that they do. But now we're looking increasingly at the possibility that Hunter Biden may, in fact, go to trial on these charges. We know that the former president, who is currently the frontrunner for the Republican Party, is also looking at a trial while he is also looking at running for president. Now it looks like the president's son may also be going to trial. How does all of this factor into the upcoming presidential election? At least, what's the scuttlebutt there on Capitol Hill, Scott?
Well, there's a reality that's inescapable here. You are the subject of a federal criminal charge filed in mid-2023, just like Donald Trump is in Florida, just like Hunter Biden is in Delaware. You're on a natural trajectory. The inertia pushes you towards a trial date, in mid-2024. It's just the normal biorhythm of the federal court system. Mid-2024 is quite a time for people with the last names of Biden and Trump to be going on trial for obvious reasons. There are any number of tripwires, though, along the way that can cause delays. You likely will see the president's legal team try to exercise some of those tripwires to push that Florida federal criminal trial from May 2024 until after the election. There's no reason to believe if a Biden case were headed toward a trial date that the defense or maybe even the prosecutor would seek to delay it potentially till after the trial or till after the election. But that's just the pace of the federal court system. You measure things by years. And this case, which was introduced in the federal court system in Wilmington in June 2023, if it did go to trial, would likely land with a trial date in 2024, just like Donald Trump did in Florida and just like Donald Trump did in Manhattan.
All right, and we know you'll be watching all of it, Scott. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
We're going to bring in now CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, you have been following this as well. You have a lot of experience in this field. Both the prosecutors and the defense worked together on this deal. Tell us, how surprised are you that we find ourselves in this position today with the judge, in essence, poking holes at it to the point at which it seems like it's completely fallen apart?
I'm surprised. We talked about this earlier this morning. I was on air and I said, I expect the judge to look under the hood, to kick the tires, to be a little more searching than in typical cases. This isn't a typical case for a whole host of reasons that you just heard from Scott. But I ultimately thought, because the negotiations were so contentious and so lengthy that both sides fully understood what this plea agreement was about, there was some inclination that all of us probably should have picked up on, which is right after the plea deal was announced, Hunter Biden's attorney said, we understand that we're done here, that we're not looking at foreign lobbying. And then there was reporting that the U.S. attorney, that the prosecutors said, actually, that's still on the table. I had thought that behind closed doors, they had come to an agreement, that there was an understanding of what this plea deal included. Again, because the reporting indicated it was so contentious and that it took them so long to come to this agreement. Then you have the moment of fate today in court where the judge says, can we still, the reporting indicates, the judge says, can we still see potentially charges related to this foreign lobbying and potentially failure to register as a foreign lobbyist? And the prosecution says, yes. The defense says, then we don't have a plea deal here. Then we're done. And that is extraordinary. I will say that in my experience, plea deals, yes, they can fall apart. But when you have had both sides have such lengthy negotiations, that it does surprise me. I wish I could say I expected it. I did not.
Pretty remarkable if this is surprising. Jessica Levinson, we appreciate your insight on this. Stand by for us as we continue to gather more information and wait for an outcome. We do want to bring in Thomas Dupree Jr., once again, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Now that we've kind of passed through what some of the conflict had been even before today, give us your sense as to what happens next now that this plea deal has fell through, at least to the point that the judge says come up with something else. What's your instinct?
Well, I think the first thing that's going to have to happen is the government is going to have to decide if it wants to move full steam ahead on this prosecution or whether it wants to try to put this prosecution on the back burner until it can decide what, if anything, it's going to do on other potential charges. Right now, we thought we were coming in this morning where this whole chapter of Hunter Biden's life was going to be wrapped up. It's not. But right now, I think the ball is in the government's court as to whether they actually want to move ahead on these charges and start bringing this case before a jury, or if they're going to say, look, let's just put this, in a holding pattern. Let's see what we're going to do on these other charges. Let's finish our investigation on his foreign dealings and that sort of thing. Then maybe we'll bring charges on those. Maybe we'll let him go. Or then maybe at that point, we will, in fact, be able to wrap everything up into one big plea agreement.
A lot going on there. Thomas Dupree, thank you for joining us. We're, of course, going to follow all of these developments throughout the day. We do have a lot more to get to. So at this point, we're going to thank you, Thomas, Catherine Herridge, Scott McFarland, and Jessica Levinson as well.
Yeah, we'll have updates on this throughout the day, no doubt. The massive heat dome that's impacted the West right now, it's moving east, putting millions of Americans under heat advisories.
Temperatures across the Midwest are climbing. Forecasters say they will be 10 to 20 degrees higher than normal in parts of the region. Some areas will see triple digits.
The CDC says many parts of the country have seen the highest rates of heat-related illness in 5 years, and these conditions will worsen before they improve. Joining us now is CBS News Minnesota meteorologist Lisa Meadows. Lisa, it looks like you're out there braving the heat. In addition to the heat storms in Minneapolis knocking out power for thousands of people overnight, how are people faring without AC today?
Right. Well, workers have been out early this morning to help restore power, but also to help when it comes